First and foremost, we extend our welcome. Brother Eric, thanks for returning to PID Radio.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Dirk, and your listeners.
We have been doing a series over the last month or so focusing on conspiracies, and there is no more prominent conspiracy in the history of the United States, if not the world, than the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Your research into that event takes a very different perspective from those of other researchers, and we wanted to get your take on it because we are impressed. First of all, it is a fresh look on the day, but also because it is so meticulously researched. In a nutshell, can you give us an overview? And I guess the big question would be, who do you see, based on the evidence you've researched, as being responsible for the death of President Kennedy?
The ones that I blame for being behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy are the Jesuits, subject to their general, who at that time was Jean-Baptist Jansen's. And the Jesuits then are in command or in control of the Roman hierarchy, which the most powerful churchman at the time in 1963 was the Archbishop of New York, Francis Cardinal Spellman, who in turn was the protector of the American Lange, or the American branch, of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And these Knights of Malta of his were in key positions of power at the time of the assassination, so that it can be proven that through them that indeed the Vatican was behind the murder of President Kennedy.
Well, the most obvious question, I think, following from that statement is, why would the Vatican take out the first Roman Catholic president in American history?
Because he was disobedient. He resisted the papacy, he resisted the Jesuits, he resisted the Knights of Malta, he resisted their Cold War. I have a list of things that he did that was absolutely forgotten, and therefore justified this piece of business or executive action called his murder.
Okay, so let's look at the events of the day then. In what way would the hand of the Jesuits have worked in Dallas on that day?
Okay, we'll go back a few years.
Okay.
After, of course, the Knights of Malta were the ones who brought on World War II. They controlled FDR. Patrick Cardinal Hayes put FDR in office in 1932. He used certain Knights of Malta to do it. One of them was Joseph Kennedy, and also another one was Mr. Brady, whose wife Genevieve was a Dame of Malta, Nicholas Brady. Nicholas Brady was the head of over 100 corporations at the time, and much wealthier than the Rockefellers. So the Knights of Malta brought on World War II, backing FDR, backing Hitler, backing Mussolini, secretly backing Stalin, and backing Churchill. And so they controlled all the factions of World War II, and they orchestrated them together for the purposes that they wanted to accomplish. After World War II, they then inaugurated the Cold War. So the Knights of Malta are the great cold warriors. They had much to accomplish in that time, one of the things being the continual dismemberment of the British Empire, which was historically Protestant. So they were continuing their Cold War, which was a hoax, controlling both sides, of course, weakening the U.S. while building Russia and China. And as they continued this Cold War, Kennedy came along and wanted to end it. One of the things that he wanted to do was end Cardinal Spellman's war in Vietnam. That's called Spelly's War. Another thing he wanted to do is he wanted to prevent the Pope's Masonic Jewish labor Zionist government of Israel from acquiring a nuclear weapon. This was absolutely forbidden because, remember, the Jesuits wanted to have what they considered to be the medieval or the Dark Age kingdom of Jerusalem secured so that they can rebuild the third Hebrew temple for ultimately a pope of their making. To do that, they have to have weapons supremacy there in Israel, and Kennedy wanted to prevent that. Another reason is that Kennedy crossed the Jesuit Order's Federal Reserve Bank. Of course, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Class A stockholders like Citibank and J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan were all run by Knights of Malta, Martin of Shea, and others. So Kennedy printed $4.3 billion in United States notes, outraging the Knights because he didn't use Federal Reserve notes that are collect interest from who passed them around. Kennedy also wanted to, in the stopping of the Vietnam War, that would have cut the partnership between the CIA and the Mafia in their drug trade to bring out their drugs out of the Golden Triangle. And remember that the Mafia and the OSS had a relationship throughout World War II in Operation Underworld, whereby Spellman used the Mafia Dons of New York, particularly Luciano, to supposedly secure the invasion of Sicily. So we've had an ongoing relationship between the CIA and the Mafia, and Albert Vincent Peroni was CIA, he was on the intel, and he was part of the Gambino family. And I still maintain that Carlo Gambino was a high-level Knight of Malta, along with John McCone at the time of the Kennedy assassination. So we have high-level Knights involved in the Mafia, the CIA, and if the Vietnam War would have ended, the drug trade as we know it today, this tremendously lucrative drug trade for the papacy while destroying the major cities of the United States would have ended.
So the Vatican, through the Jesuits, were actually benefiting from that drug trade from Southeast Asia?
Absolutely. That is their drug trade. They ran the whole all the opium wars in the 19th century using the British, because remember the British century was that century by which they used the British to overthrow the Manchu dynasty and a series of other things. And that drug trade, that opium trade, was completely in the hands of the Black Pope through the English branch of the Knights of Malta and high-level Freemasonry.
So you've got John F. Kennedy then, who was looking to put a stop to the war in Vietnam and the drug trade running from that part of the world, prevent Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons, and severing America's relationship with the federal, or dependence on the Federal Reserve Bank.
That's right. The other thing was he wanted to cut the tax breaks for the big oilmen. So that brings in Murchison and Hunt. He was going to get rid of those tax breaks. And I maintain that those Texas oilmen, those billionaires, were also connected to the Vatican by knighthoods. And so therefore, because the Vatican runs the whole oil industry, George Herbert Walker Bush is probably one of the most powerful Knights of Malta in the world. He is a kingpin in the Pope's international oil bonanza. Of course, the papacy set up Saudi Arabia in 1932 with King Ibn Saud using Benito Mussolini, whose advisor was Pietro Tacci Venturi, the secretary of the Society of Jesus. So the Jesuits control not only the drug trade, they control the international oil market. And Kennedy wanted to cut that.
George H.W. Bush is a Knight of Malta?
That's right, and so was his brother, Prescott Bush Jr., and so was his father, Prescott Bush Sr., and Prescott Bush Sr. was a partner with one of Germany's most powerful Knights of Malta and fanatical Roman Catholics, Fritz Thyssen. Fritz Thyssen purchased the Brown House for Adolf Hitler. Without Fritz Thyssen, there is no Adolf Hitler. Without Franz von Papen, that Knight of Malta, there is no Adolf Hitler. And Michael Cardinal von Faulhaber, who was the Archbishop of Munich, was also a Knight of Malta. And without Faulhaber, there is no Hitler.
Now, I'm going to ask a question that may be rather naive and may demonstrate a real lack of understanding of the way this thing works. But don't you have to be Roman Catholic to be a Knight of Malta?
No. Henry Luce was a Presbyterian. He was a Knight of Malta. He was a most notorious Knight of Malta, right across the street from St. Patrick's Cathedral, where he was residing in Rockefeller Center, and Luce controlled the press. You don't have to be Catholic to be a Knight of Malta. There are those knights who are ancient nobility Catholics, like J. Peter Grace and Andrew Bertie and others, but they do admit others into the order who are not Catholic. They've admitted certain Jews into the order, one of them being Major Lewis M. Bloomfield, who Jim Garrison wanted to investigate, question, but he was not allowed to. And Bloomfield was tied to big industry in Israel. He's a Jew, and yet he's a Knight of Malta, affiliated and a director on CMC, the Seigneurial Mondial Commercial, which is also involved with Terminix. So you don't have to be Catholic necessarily. That is a very key thing.
Okay, so the Knights of Malta are more, obviously, than just a social fraternity.
Right.
What is their purpose, then?
Their purpose, of course, their purpose is to restore the temporal power of the Pope around the world, that the Pope will rule all the governments of the world, all the banks, all the parties, academia, medicine, law, everything that's necessary to maintain the temporal power, the political power of the Pope. And if you remember, the Pope has the two keys. It's a clandestine skull and crossbones. If you look at the papal flag, you have the triple crown and you have two keys. It's clandestine skull and crossbones. And the two keys symbolize the spiritual power of the Pope, that every individual in the world must be subject to his spiritual power, and that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And the second power is his temple power, that every nation, every king, every president must be one of his altar boys, that they must submit to his political will. And the nation that does not do that comes under the attack of the papacy. A president who will not do that will come under the attack of the Knights and the Jesuits. This was the case with Kennedy.
How long have the Knights of Malta been around?
They've been around since the 11th century. They were one of the first order created for the purpose of the Crusades to take Jerusalem, quote-unquote, from the infidel Muslims. And they then, after Jerusalem was taken in the First Crusade, they then became the protectors for all the pilgrims who would come to Jerusalem. And they became the great merchants of the earth. They were the ones whose navy would war with the Muslim navy, and they would. But they were the military men, because it's called the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. They were first known as the Hospitallers and the Knights of Rhodes, and then finally the Knights of Malta. But that was their early beginning. Okay,
so they were founded about the same time as the Knights Templar.
That's right. The Knights Templars were founded after them, shortly after.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So the Knights Templars are the high-level Masons of today. The Hospitallers, the Knights Hospitallers, are the Knights of Malta today, and they work together.
Okay. So how was the organization set up then in 1962, and the group that plotted against John F. Kennedy?
Okay, I'll go back a little bit.
All right.
The Knights of Malta were made subject to the Jesuits as a result of the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
This is important. The Jesuits had been expelled from Malta in 1768. So when they caused the French Revolution and brought Napoleon to power out of Corsica, they used Napoleon with his navy to take Malta back. Take Malta and take all the treasures and weapons so they could conduct a crusade into the Middle East, and they drove the Knights of Malta into the court of Russia. And from the time that they were in the court of Russia to 1917, they were the real power in Russia, and they were expelled openly by Lenin in 1917. So the Knights of Malta were made subject to the Jesuit order in about 1800 when they were driven to Russia, and the Jesuit general was resident in Russia at that time because the Jesuits had been suppressed by the Pope's bull, Dominic Acredemptor Noster, in 1773. So the Knights are now, at that time, subject to the Jesuits, and they will do their bidding, and they have done their bidding. So now when we come to the Kennedy assassination, as we see the Knights of Malta, they now are subject to the Jesuits, as the Jesuits control the Roman hierarchy, and the Roman hierarchy controls the Knights of Malta. So as the head of the Knights of Malta in the U.S. at the time was Spellman, he then controlled the Knights of Malta, but he was under the advice of the Jesuits from Georgetown University.
Okay. So the Jesuits at Georgetown controlled or advised Archbishop Spellman in New York.
That's correct, and also the Jesuits from Fordham. Jesuits from Fordham and Georgetown.
Okay. So then was Cardinal Spellman involved in the operational planning for this, or did he just make it known that this is something that needed to be done and then let others take the ball and run with it as far as how it would be carried out?
Cardinal Spellman was the one who gave the order to his J. Peter Grace J. Peter Grace was the head of the Knights of Malta in 1963. J. Peter Grace was the one who brought in many, many Nazis into the U.S. and hired several of them for his firm, W.R. Grace. And so Grace then handed it to his subordinate knights, like John McCone, Alan Dulles, who was another Knight of Malta.
Really?
And not a Catholic, by the way. And so we have the heads of the CIA usually always being Knights of Malta, from Wild Bill Donovan to Dulles to John McCone. And so there they then orchestrated, and the most powerful Knight of Malta in the FBI at the time was the assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, Arthur DeLoach.